Reflect. Mirroring the most reasonable, passionate, good, loving, gracious, creative, and powerful person ever. By Thaddeus Williams. Chapter 1. The Future Self-Reflector. Imagine you are escorted through an underground laboratory into a controversial machine, some kind of future self-reflector. You step inside a big metal cube and are told to think about whatever you love most in the world. A wall of glass rises out of the floor, dividing the cube into two equal chambers. Then everything goes dark. Your earliest memories start to project one after another on the glass. All of your firsts and all of your favorites, side-aching laughs, heart-palpitating joys, gut-punching rejections, all of it beams from your consciousness and onto the screen. On the opposite side of the glass, all the flashing rays of your personal movie reel seem to cluster together and take form. As the defining ideas and feelings and choices of your life speed through the glass, your future self slowly materializes in the other chamber. Then the lights come up, the glass goes down, and you stand there, eye to eye with your future self. 1.1 Emerson's Law. Blinking before you is the person you will become if all of your loves and hates, strengths, flaws, habits, and fears were to develop on course over the coming years. This is not a two-dimensional image doctored up with flattering filters. It's the real flesh and blood person you are becoming, for better or worse, staring back at you. In all of the up-close self-exposure of that machine, would you like the person your current character and choices have brought into existence? Would you see someone big-souled, caring, and full of life? Or someone small, self-consumed, and burned out? Someone flourishing or falling apart? Someone virtuous or vicious? Deep or dull? Who are you becoming? There is no need to wait for future self-reflecting technology to answer those questions. There is one question that you can ask yourself now that, when answered honestly, can generate the same kind of future unveiling insight. That question is, simply put, what does your life say is the most important thing in the universe? If you were to stop and take honest stock of yourself, how you choose to spend your daily doses of breath and energy, which ideas occupy the most space in your thought world, what more than anything else moves you? Think about it. Be real with yourself. Whatever that ultimate something is for you now offers tremendous clarity about the person you are turning into. American poet Ralph Waldo Emerson helps us see why. Says Emerson, "A person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret, in the dark recesses of our hearts, but it will come out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our loves and our character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship, for what we are worshiping, we are becoming." Emerson makes two keen observations. First, that everyone worships something, and second, that those deities will shape our identities. As for the first observation, David Foster Wallace, the celebrated American novelist who rejected belief in any traditional notion of God, follows Emerson. Says Wallace, "In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." With Emerson and Wallace, it was the great Russian storyteller and skilled excavator of human nature, Fyodor Dostoevsky, who found that, quote, "Man has no more constant and agonizing anxiety than to find as quickly as possible someone to worship." We can trace this insight long before Dostoevsky to a Jewish scholar named Paul, who went on to write much of the Christian New Testament. In the opening lines of his long letter to Rome, Paul notes that people who don't worship the Creator don't cease to worship, but rather worship creation in one way or another. For the mystic, the atheist, the existentialist, and the theologian above, the real question is not whether we worship. They all took that to be an observable fact. The most important question is what we worship. With reverent hands trembling, we all place something in that altar of empty space we find inside ourselves. These four diverse minds converge on this point and encourage us to choose that sacred something with extreme care, because whatever we choose to worship will inevitably shape us for better or worse. 1.2. The theist and atheist in every heart. Before asking how our chosen deities shape our identities, it's worth thinking about a predictable question. That is, what about true atheists who claim no deity whatsoever? Don't the many non-worshippers around the globe count as living, breathing proof against Emerson's law? Well, in Emerson and Wallace and Dostoevsky and Paul's defense, consider how we express the impulse to worship even when we try to be our most anti-religious. It was, after all, the anti-religious Parisians of the French Enlightenment who hired a 14-year-old actress named Mademoiselle Candé to dress up and play the goddess of reason. In the spring of 1792, wearing their Sunday's best, they marched this teenage girl along the Seine riverbanks and into Notre Dame Cathedral. There they sang hymns to their new deity in a sacred ritual that would soon catch on in Lyon and other cities all over France. Religion did not fade away. The spotlight of human souls simply shifted to a new object of worship. Reason didn't replace religion, it became a religion. Or read Carl Sagan, the brilliant and unapologetically atheist astronomer. You will meet a devout man, a worshiper on his knees before the cosmos, which Sagan capitalizes, writing science books that read like hymnals full of zeal, awe, reverence, and poetry. Sagan's Voyager Golden Record and Pioneer plaque, with greetings from and directions to Earth, were affixed to spacecraft and hurled into space like prayers. Sagan's desperate hope for answers from someone beyond what he called our pale blue dot. The cosmos didn't replace God, it became a God for Sagan, where we look for meaning and salvation. Or consider one of the most aggressively anti-religious regimes in history, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, and later Khrushchev and Brezhnev. The Society of the Godless, which was also known as the League of Militant Atheists, was formed. Russian churches and synagogues were bulldozed. Atheism became a state-enforced dogma. Did such aggressive acts of atheism produce the godless utopia that the Soviet leaders dreamed of? On the contrary, worship was redirected to a new deity, Lord Stalin, while tens of millions of heretics who refused to bow to this new god were starved or executed. The Society of the Godless was anything but godless. For as G.K. Chesterton observed, once we abolish God, the government becomes God. In the very act of abolishing religion in the traditional sense of the term, our own natures betray us, and it becomes clear to others, if not to ourselves, that we remain on our knees, whether before reason, the cosmos, the state, or something else. In addition to the cases of religious anti-religiosity above, cases in which one deity is swapped for another, we may add that, in a certain meaningful sense, everyone is both an atheist and a theist at the same time. I personally am an atheist about Kali, the Hindu goddess of destruction, just as Kali worshippers are atheists about the god I worship. There are stalkers who worship their celebrity crush, materialists who worship their car, narcissists who worship their own mirror image, and North Koreans who worship their supreme leader. The majority of us, I would venture to guess, are atheists about their chosen objects of supreme devotion. They worship something that we don't, just as the most important things to us are likely irrelevant to them. I've taught college classes like History of Atheism for nearly a decade. I've conversed with hundreds of atheists. I have a great many friends who are self-described atheists or agnostics, and whom I respect and love very much. Nevertheless, I've never known anyone who is not on his or her knees to something or someone. I'm just as much of an atheist towards what many of my atheist friends deem most important in life as they are atheists towards what, or rather who, matters most to me. I think that this way of seeing things takes us further than many of the broken record debates that have been playing for centuries between theists and atheists around the question of God's existence. There is a great deal that can be learned from that ongoing conversation, especially when it's a conversation rather than an insult-hurling shouting match. But the sooner we acknowledge that we're all theists and atheists simultaneously, that we are all supremely devoted to some things and undevoted to others, that we stake our meaning in places where others don't, and vice versa, then the more we can move forward thinking together about which of these different gods bring out the best and worst in people. If anyone remains bothered by calling their objects of supreme devotion God, if referring to that supreme devotion itself with the word worship annoys anyone, then that is all well and fine. I wouldn't want a semantic squabble to derail things. Bothered readers can simply substitute the G word for whatever is most important to them, whatever they are most deeply moved for, their highest priority, their deepest love. And we can move forward to Emerson's deeper point. That is, how that all-important something for each of us shapes us in significant ways. Identifying those different somethings can produce the same eye-opening results as our futuristic, soul-reflecting machine. 1.3. The Unhappy Fate of Charles Darwin. Let us call this Emerson's Law. Our objects of veneration have a way of defining the scope and contours of our soul's formation or deformation. We end up bearing the image of our chosen deities for better or worse. People become the most like whatever they most love. Consider a few examples. If we worship products, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn observed of America's consumer culture, then we slowly become more product-like ourselves. Like the latest trendy toy, we cease to be a deep, significant, and soul-filling presence in the lives of others. We become more artificial, more manufactured, more plastic. If we worship our romantic partners, then we tend to lose our own identities and slowly morph into our partner's unimaginative clone. If we worship our kids, then we can slowly become more childish, lacking the kind of wisdom and authority that should go with being a grown-up and a parent. If we worship other people's opinions, elevating other people's view of us to all-important status, then we can gradually lose ourselves and become exactly who we think others want us to be. If we worship sex, or at least the biological rush of sex for its own sake, in which other people are reduced to a merely physical means to that end, that is, sex as a soulless animal act, then we tend to become more soulless ourselves, less and less able to connect with and meaningfully love other people as people for their own sake. If we worship sexual icons, becoming pornography addicts who treat people as mere mindless, heartless, two-dimensional images, then we become more two-dimensional ourselves. Our every act of worship before a glowing screen renders our minds a little dumber and our hearts a little more numb. We get a clear picture of Emerson's law in the lives of two very different men. First, consider this law at work in the life of Charles Darwin. This gifted man of science slowly evolved into that which he deemed most important in life. In Darwin's words, "My chief enjoyment and sole employment throughout life has been scientific work. From this work," Darwin added, "I am never idle, as it is the only thing which makes life endurable to me." As one scholar observes, Charles Darwin became, in modern parlance, a workaholic. He felt emotionally secure only when he was at work. What effect did elevating scientific work to the place of supreme importance have on the kind of person Darwin became? Hear it from Darwin's own autobiography. In Darwin's words, "In one respect, my mind has changed during the last 20 or 30 years. Up to the age of 30 or beyond it, poetry of many kinds gave me great pleasure. And even as a schoolboy, I took intense delight in Shakespeare. But now, for many years, I cannot endure to read a line of poetry. I have tried lately to read Shakespeare and found it so intolerably dull that it nauseated me. And I've almost lost my taste for pictures or music. Darwin then describes the man he became in words that read heavy with remorse. Says Darwin, "My mind seems to have become a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts. The loss of these tastes is a loss of happiness, and may possibly be injurious to the intellect, and more probably the moral character, by enfeebling the emotional part of our nature." We should weep for Darwin. This extraordinarily gifted man was turned into a kind of scientific law-grinding machine, a man whose love for great poetry turned to nausea, whose heart for art and music slowly turned to stone. What a nightmarish travesty to live through the unhappy petrification of your emotion, moral character, and intellect. Darwin came to see himself not as a robust soul bursting with life, full of years and wisdom and joy, but as, in his own words, quote, "a withered leaf for every subject except science," which he saw, again in his words, as a great evil. I wonder if the young Darwin could have stepped inside our future self-reflector and met the machine, the withered leaf, the unhappy man who emerged from the other side. Would he have restructured his priorities? Consider Emerson's law at work, though with radically different results, in the life of another influential genius, a man who has been branded as America's first and best homegrown philosopher. This celebrated philosopher, who will remain anonymous until the end of our chapter, offers the following autobiographical account of how his chosen object of worship affected his soul over the years. It brought an inexpressible purity, brightness, peacefulness, and ravishment to the soul. In other words, it made my soul like a field or garden with all manner of pleasant flowers, all pleasant, delightful, and undisturbed, enjoying a sweet calm. Two gifted men. One became a withered leaf, the other a garden, bursting with life and beauty and delight. Where did our second genius find his chief enjoyment? What did he worship? Did different objects of ultimate devotion have anything to do with the very different kind of men these two became? 1.4. The X-Planet's Icy Revenge. We move toward a better understanding of Emerson's law and the radically divergent results it can produce with the help of the old word glory. Much of the ancient meaning of this word has been lost in the 21st century. When Jews of the ancient Near Eastern world spoke of glory, or kavod as they would say in Hebrew, they spoke of weightiness, heaviness, massiveness, and substance. That's why one ancient Jew, Isaiah, talks about growing lean, withered grass, dust on scales, and empty wind as the opposites of glory. It's why the ancient Jewish monarch David describes being satisfied with God as being satisfied with fat and rich food, and why Paul spoke of the eternal weight of glory. While kavod meant heaviness, the opposite of light, the ancients also used glory almost synonymously with light. Ezekiel saw God's temple filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. And Isaiah looked forward to a day when the sun shall no more be your light by day, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory. And viewed through Paul's eyes, God was not a distant, flickering idea, but someone very real, luminous, beaming. How can this old word help us understand the different ways in which deities shape identities today? Think of something both weighty and radiant that roughly half of the Earth's population can observe at this very moment: the sun. The sun has enough kavod, enough weightiness and radiance to be the center point of our solar system. It has enough gravitas to keep Earth and the other planets spinning through space on their proper orbits. It is also luminous enough to keep our tiny blue planet teeming with warmth and beauty and life. What would happen, however, if Pluto, disgruntled and embittered by the 2006 International Astronomical Union vote that stripped him of planetary rights, took revenge on our solar system with a plot to overthrow and replace the sun? Pluto's cosmic coup would prove catastrophic. With a surface that is 98% frozen nitrogen and a mass less than a quarter of Earth's, Pluto is no match for the sun's kavod. The shift from a heliocentric to a Plutocentric system would send the 8 remaining planets spinning off their trajectories and into chaos. The icy X-planet's lack of mass and radiance would soon turn Earth into a cold, dark, lifeless sphere drifting through lonesome space. The insight here becomes clear if we move from astronomy to psychology, from the space around us to the space inside of us. If we place something too small and too dim at the center of our lives, something that lacks kavod, then the planets in our soul's solar system, our creativity, our intellect, our emotions, our moral sense, our relationships, and so on, will tend toward a state of chaos and lifelessness. The lack of weight will cause many of those planets to drift into empty space, while the lack of light will turn any life on those planets into desolate sprawls of withered leaves. If, however, the center of our souls, that which we glorify the most, is in reality glorious, then our object of worship is massive enough to pull all the diverse spheres of our personalities into a more meaningful and balanced orbit. There's also enough light to turn those different spheres inside of us, our creativity, intellect, emotions, moral sense, relationships, etc., into planets teeming with life and color, like a garden. 1.5. 3 marks of kavod. If we put Emerson's law together with the ancient Hebrew idea of kavod, we reach something like this. Everybody lives like something is the most weighty and radiant thing in the universe. If that something is, in reality, weighty and radiant, then our lives will over time take on something of that gravitas and glow. If we glorify inglorious things, however, then over time we ourselves become more weightless and shadowy, more like ghosts. Have you ever encountered a ghost in real life? We all have. People whose lifestyles and spirit you could almost wave your hand through without bumping against anything solid. We also encounter glorious people from time to time. People who may weigh the same as anyone else on a bathroom floor scale, but who would likely twirl the needle like a clockwise tornado if there were such a thing as a soul-weighing scale. There are see-through people and technicolor people, with 1,000 shades in between. The most authentic, vivid, and substantial people you've ever met did not fall asleep one night as ghosts and wake up as sages. There's a backstory behind the best and worst of people. If you follow that backstory deep enough, you will almost always find something glorious that long ago began forming the most robust souls and something inglorious at the heart of every ghost. What then makes something glorious, and therefore a center of weight and light in our lives, versus something that lacks kavod? I offer 3 marks of glory. 1. The most glorious things are first, not second things. There is a very real difference between first and second things. A partygoer who makes fitting in his first thing, for example, will find himself preoccupied with his social performance, analyzing and overanalyzing his every move. Do you think he will achieve his goal to fit in? No. Constant self-analysis will leave him crucial seconds behind social cues. A cyclone of self-doubt will tear through his brain, whisking away all humor, confidence, and in-the-moment connection with others. Our partygoer turns into the very oddball he dreads becoming. His efforts to fit in have made fitting in impossible. Why? because he's mistaken a second thing for a first thing, a byproduct for a goal. If only he put something else first, like caring about the people around him so much that he forgets to worry about himself, then he would likely find himself fitting in without even trying. Life is full of these paradoxes. The most miserable people are often those who spend all their energy trying to be happy. People who become the most toxic in relationships tend to be the very people who hyper-obsess about finding the perfect mate. The person who spends all his brain power getting everyone to like him ends up lonesome, too self-absorbed to be a true friend. C.S. Lewis points us to the principle behind these paradoxes. Says Lewis, every preference of a small good to a great, or a partial good to a total good, involves the loss of the small or partial good for which the sacrifice is made. You can't get second things by putting them first. You get second things only by putting first things first. David Foster Wallace helps us bring Lewis's principle out of abstraction into the real world where we worship, cataloging some of the most popular second things that make for lousy gods. Says Wallace, if you worship money and things, if they're where you tap real meaning in life, then you will never have enough, never feel you have enough. It's the truth. Worship your body and beauty and sexual allure, and you will always feel ugly. Worship power, you will end up feeling weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over others to numb you to your own fear. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart. You will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. So whatever else we might say about a truly glorious object, something really worth worshiping, it must be a first thing. This leads us to a second mark of kavod. The most glorious things are unbreakable, not brittle things. I used to think that church songs, where you could swap out all the God references with baby, were evidence of a sappy, spiritualized romanticism in Western Christianity. There may be truth to that, but perhaps the interchangeability of God and baby in church songs says less about church songs and more about love songs. Less about how churches man-size God, which does happen, and more about a much broader tendency in the church and culture at large to God-size our romantic partners. I was blessed the day I found you, gonna build my whole world around you. You're everything good, girl, and you're all that matters to me. The Temptations, you're my everything. There's no love like your love, and no other could give more love. Take me as I am, take my life. I would give it all, I would sacrifice. You know it's true, everything I do it for you. Bryan Adams, Everything I Do. We can reach the heavens and touch the sky. You believe in me, I'll believe in you. If we believe in each other, there's nothing we can't do. Celine Dion, Love Can Move Mountains. You're my religion, you're my church, you're the holy grail at the end of my search. Sting, Sacred Love. She tells me, worship in the bedroom. The only heaven I'll be sent to is when I'm alone with you. Hosier, Take Me to Church. I live my whole life through giving thanks to you, 'cause your eyes are the windows to heaven. Your smile could heal 1,000,000 souls. Your love completes my existence. Amel Leroux, Make Me Whole. When I was in graduate school, I met Jane. Jane was enjoying a new romantic relationship. She was the kind of person who was always in a relationship, with a list of exes that seemed to roll on like the movie credits of a Peter Jackson film. After listening to Jane's story of breakup after heart-stomping breakup, I saw a glint of hope in her eyes when she started describing her new special someone. Her description started to sound more and more like an ancient psalmist describing Yahweh. He's perfect in every way. He's so good to me. He's my rock, my breath of life, my everything. Suddenly it became clear. Jane was not in a relationship. She was in a religion. She was looking to her boyfriend not to fill boyfriend-sized needs, but to fill God-sized needs, seeking nothing less than absolute perfection. and she was convinced that she had found it. What will happen, however, when the rock hammer of reality starts to chip away at that flawless statue, eventually crumbling the bigger-than-life effigy of her boyfriend that Jane built up in her imagination? Jane will be devastated. Not because her boyfriend let her down, but because her God, her functional deity, has failed her. Her whole identity that was built around the brittle idol comes crashing down. And the boyfriend himself, as opposed to the one who existed only in Jane's imagination, will likely feel crushed under the burden of superhuman expectations that have been heaped on his shoulders. What we are really talking about here is proportions. When we see people in their proper size, as people rather than gods, then their faults appear in proportion to their size, that is, as human faults. If, however, we blow people up to God-sized dimensions in our imaginations, then what are in reality finite faults will appear to us as infinitely huge faults. Faults that should merely hurt us, but end up apocalyptically destroying us. This superhumanness that we often attribute to mere humans is one reason people go from deifying to demonizing their romantic partners. We can do the same things with our kids and even celebrities. And it's exactly what Jane ended up doing with her new boyfriend, who was soon added to her rolling credits of exes. So something worth worshiping must be superhuman and unbreakable, not only in our imaginations, but in reality. If only we had an object of worship like that, something or someone proportionate to our heart's massive needs, then the people in our lives would shrink back to their actual human proportions, and so would the cracks in their characters. The restless Jane in all of us would find herself freed up to love people realistically as people, suffering finite hurt rather than infinite devastation when, not if, we are let down. And we would free up the people we care about to really love us back, unburdened by the crushing gravity of our infinite expectations. Returning to Lewis's categories, we find the real joy and meaning of second things only when we find ourselves enjoying and drawing our deepest meaning from a first thing, which leads us to a third mark of something with enough kavod to worship. The most glorious things are suns, not spotlights. A spotlight sends out one long, narrow cone of light, leaving everything outside that cone in darkness. A sun, however, is omnidirectional, firing out light rays in all directions simultaneously. Some of the things that we choose to worship are more like spotlights than suns. Put academic accolades at the center of your life, and your intellect may brighten, but your emotions and relationships will be left in the dark. Worship a romantic partner, and some passion may light up, but your intellect will be left to the cold and the cobwebs. When we turn good things into ultimate things, or make certain bright things the central and primary light source in our lives, they leave other important spaces in our natures hidden in the shadows. This helps us make more sense out of the way in which we become like whatever we worship. If we worship money, then it's not that we become green and wrinkly, but that money lacks the necessary properties to really illuminate the intellectual, emotional, and relational spaces in our lives. Cash is too mindless, too heartless, too loveless. Worship it long enough, and the best things in us remain in the dark, and we slowly appear as dumb and uncaring as cold hard cash. That's how we become like what we worship. If we say that the product worshiper becomes more product-like himself, more plastic, then plastic is really a shorthand way of expressing a lack of intellectual, emotional, and relational light. Consumer products are inadequate gods because they're too powerless to illuminate all that is best in human nature. So when malls become our churches, and material things are objects of ultimate concern, then the best things in us are neglected, left in the dark. Shoppers in the cult of consumerism will then start to look more and more like the plastic mannequins that they look to for meaning, and they will become about as interesting to talk to. This is what I meant earlier when I said that in the world of experience, the doctrine of the Imago Dei is not optional, that people will bear the image of their gods for better or worse. Or, as the theologians of ancient Israel observed, people went after false idols and became false. So picture your capacity to reason, feel, achieve moral greatness, love people well, help those in need, create and appreciate beauty. Imagine all of these powers of your humanity arranged around the primary light source in your life. Is that light source, your object of worship, like a spotlight with its solitary cone fixed on a part of you while banishing the rest of you to darkness? Or is your object of worship solar, beaming warmth and clarity and meaning on all the wonderfully diverse spheres that go with being human? Overview. Earlier we met an anonymous genius who grew to be a garden. A man who is widely acknowledged to be America's most important and original philosophical theologian. He was a valedictorian graduate of Yale, where he enrolled as a Latin, Greek, and Hebrew fluent 12-year-old. He was instrumental to America's First Great Awakening. He preached meticulously logical sermons that were cut short more than once, when the volume of piercing and amazing cries from affected crowds overpowered his famously weak voice. He defended Native American rights and inspired one of the first schools in America that gave women educational parity with men. He served as president of Princeton University. His books became required reading throughout the Ivy League for well over a century, and he remains a beacon in 21st century academia, influencing entire schools and fields of study that didn't exist until he inspired them. He was also an adoring husband to his teenage sweetheart and wife of over 30 years, with a full quiver of 11 deeply loved children. One famous study even traced the direct bloodlines of one U.S. vice president, 3 U.S. senators, 3 governors, 3 mayors, 13 college presidents, 30 judges, 65 professors, 80 public office holders, 100 lawyers, and 100 missionaries back to his Massachusetts home. That garden of a man was Jonathan Edwards. Long before Edwards' success as a philosopher, theologian, revivalist, pastor, and family man, he believed that he had found true kavod. At age 19, while drafting 70 personal resolutions in his journal, Edwards divulges his object of lifelong worship. Resolved to cast and venture my soul on the Lord Jesus Christ, to trust and confide in him, and to consecrate myself wholly to him. This glimpse into the center of young Edwards' solar system is essential to making sense out of the man he later became. A man who, in his words, sense of divine things gradually increased and became more and more lively and had more of that inward sweetness. A man who described his soul as a flower, low and humble on the ground, opening its bosom to receive the pleasant beams of the sun's glory. There is no understanding how Edwards became a garden if we ignore the sun that nourished his soul over the decades. This brings us to the central thesis of this book, that Jesus is the most glorious being who exists, the most weighty object of worship, the most massive and radiant person our lives could possibly orbit around. He is the first thing. He is indestructible. The good things that we enjoy in life are, in Edwards' words, scattered beams, but he is the sun. Jesus is more reasonable, more passionate, more virtuous, more loving, more gracious, more creative, and more powerful than anything else. When we enjoy any true reason, passion, goodness, love, grace, and beauty and power in anything else, he is the sun we finally discover if we trace any one of those beams back to its original source. And he can shape and expand and illuminate and grow us in ways that no amount of money or power or followers or lovers or chemical rushes or any other conceivable object of worship can. Whether or not we worship him will make a crucial difference and what kind of people we can expect to step out of our future self-reflector. I can hear the obvious objection. Edwards was a fluke. What about people who claim to worship Jesus who live inglorious lives? Well, that's the beauty of Emerson's law. It calls our bluffs. Our lives will be a dead giveaway to any perceptive observer of what we really worship, regardless of our publicly claimed deities. If we are really worshiping Jesus as he really exists, and not some figment of our imaginations or a religiously conceived fictional character called Jesus, then our lives will reflect something of that real Jesus' glory. Not perfectly, of course, but perceptibly. Reflect serves as the structure of this exploration of what it would look like if we actually worshiped and became more like Jesus. In the next chapter, we look at the R, reasoning like Jesus, developing his intellectual virtues. Chapter 3 turns to the E, emoting like Jesus, feeling joy at the things that brought him joy, compassion at the things that moved him to compassion, and outrage at the things that got his blood boiling. Chapter 4 focuses on the F of reflect, that is, fighting the selfishness in our hearts in order to live out something of the moral beauty of Jesus. Chapter 5 looks at the L, loving like Jesus, cultivating the kind of relational depth and authenticity he models so well. Chapter 6 moves to the E, engaging people's needs, helping those who can't help themselves, in order to mirror something of the grace of Jesus. Next is C, creating beauty, like the artistic Jesus, whose imagination we have to thank for everything from sunsets to the spots on ladybugs. We end in chapter 8 with T, tuning in to Christ's power and presence in the mundane reality of everyday existence, so that the fruits of his rationality, emotion, virtue, love, grace, and creativity begin to grow in and out of us. For most people, the word Christ-likeness is little more than a cliche, a spiritual buzzword for people who speak a strange tribal dialect of Christianese. Press people on its meaning, and you will find that for most, Christ-likeness is vaguely synonymous with being nice. But becoming like Jesus means so much more than that, and that so much more is the focus of this book. All of this, it must be said, is coming from a man who has bowed his knee to many finite gods: intellect, religion, romance, status, jobs, kids. A man who continues to prove John Calvin right when he said that the human heart is a perpetual factory of idols. Thankfully, however, this is not a book about me, a recovering idolaholic. It's about Jesus, who specializes in healing idolaholics. Edwards said it best. There are many other things that men are trusting in to be saviors to them, but Jesus Christ is by far the best. What is there that you could desire to be in a Savior that is not in Christ?